This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Hey everybody, it's Razib. I am here with Ramesh Ponnuru, who many of you will probably know as a writer for National Review, and I think Bloomberg. You have a column for Bloomberg, right?
Yes, Bloomberg Opinion.
All right. So could you just tell everybody about all your numerous affiliations, because I know you got a lot of them.
Well, we've covered National Review and Bloomberg Opinion. I'm also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
Okay, that's a big deal. That sets people's priors. So we're here mostly to talk about social conservatism and the pro-life movement, that sort of thing. And you've written a fair amount on this topic, and obviously, you've written on various different things. Like I would say, like for the listeners, like you're one of the early reformicons. Is that correct?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay, and so that's the idea that you kind of pivot away from like maybe the extreme I don't know, economic libertarianism and focus on, family first, that sort of thing. But can you tell me a little about your background? So this is what I know. So I know that you're from Kansas. I think you have a history degree from Princeton.
True, both of those.
Okay, and your mother is Lutheran and of Indian heritage, and your father is Hindu and of Indian heritage.
Yes, my mother was. She passed away 13 years ago.
I'm sorry about that.
Or 14 years ago. Gosh, time flies.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, so I do want to say real quickly, I've seen some of the interactions online with you. So I've never been confused for you, but I have been confused for other people, and I have been called Dinesh D'Souza, which I think happens to everybody who is of the browner skin and maybe not super liberal, right? So I've seen
I think the fact that my name rhymes with Dinesh's makes it a little worse.
Okay. I don't think I've ever been confused for Raihan Salam, which is surprising to me, but I think it's going to happen. I think as he becomes more popular, I think I'm going to be confused for him. But I've seen some interactions with you with some Indians on Twitter, which is like a much bigger deal than it was 10 years ago, where they will talk about your background. And I've seen you basically say well, I mean, I don't identify in that way, or it's like they make a lot of assumptions, about you. And so I'm just curious, I mean, what would you say to people to just explain, my explanation sometimes simply is you just have to realize I'm American. So I just don't have all of this baggage that you're talking about. And that's just a simple way to explain it. How would you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, I was born and raised in Kansas City, and my parents had a mixed marriage religiously, and I think the kind of Twitter exchange to which you're referring is people saying something about my having rejected Hinduism, which isn't really true because it was sort of never presented to me as an option. My dad was not certainly. I mean, my mother was making an effort there in a way that my dad never did, so I actually was raised without religion, essentially, which is, I guess, the compromise that a lot of mixed marriages reach, and became a Christian in my adulthood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I would call myself an Indian American.
Yeah.
Certainly, but occasionally people expect me to represent something that I can't really lay claim to.
Yeah. So I mean, they're taking your name and they're extrapolating, which is like a reasonable extrapolation if you were born and raised in India. But in the United States, you're not raised in that cultural matrix. So if they don't make a huge effort, what would you know about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to India 3 times in my life, and it's been a while. I'd like to go back, but it's been a while.
Yeah. So you've been in the conservative movement for a while, and you've written on a lot of topics. I reached out to you because I actually have an Indian American friend he's center right, definitely, but he wants to know about the pro-life movement and social conservatism, and he's not really libertarian, but he's not really culturally conservative, right? So he's kind of almost perplexed by it and what it means. And I know a lot of more liberal secular Americans, they think it's religious or it has something to do with. I mean, now the whole thing is white supremacy, which I don't need to go there because I know it's like it doesn't make any sense to me either. But can you explain to someone who just comes into it, social conservatism, the conservative movement, and also being pro-life, which is a subset, like what that means, how it came about, and what its significance is to the people, depending on how you calculate it, like around half of Americans who espouse it, right?
Right. Well, I mean, it's tricky, actually, because the relationship between these things is not as simple as it once might have appeared to be. So 20 to 30 years ago, when I was first starting to write about politics, you could write about social conservatism and the pro-life or anti-abortion movement and have, a rough sense of their being kind of equal. But if you'll notice, what's happened in American culture and American politics since that time, America has become far, far more accepting of homosexuality and supportive of same-sex marriage, which I think as late as like 1996 was something like you had 27% of the public said that was a good idea or in favor of that. And now you've got, I think, about 60 there. So pretty big change. You've got a huge change on things like acceptability of marijuana and legalization of marijuana, which is now a majority position. But the abortion question hasn't moved, right? The opposition to abortion in public opinion is just as strong as it was then. And so all of us, social conservatives and our opponents, all tended to group these things all together. You're a social conservative. You don't like these changes. You believe in kind of traditional Christian or Judeo-Christian morality. And it turns out that abortion is just a different kind of issue than those other sorts of issues. Now, I do still identify myself as a social conservative as well as a pro-lifer. I think of myself as a pro-lifer because on basically civil rights grounds. I mean, I think that we're talking about an act of lethal violence against a defenseless class of human beings who need the protection of the laws. I'm a social conservative because I believe in things like, people need families to flourish, and that requires a supportive cultural, economic, and legal environment. And we should look at ways to try to create that. So as you know, but maybe not all of your listeners do, one of the causes I've been involved in for the last 20 years or so has been arguing that our economic policy systematically underweights the interests of parents. And we need to have an enlarged child tax credit to help provide them economic support. That to me is an extension of social conservatism. It's the idea that we're not just individuals and the government. We also need a flourishing civil society in between, with families and churches and communities. And government has a subsidiary but important role to play in shoring up the health of all of these institutions.
So, I mean, were you always pro-life? Because I know you said that you were more libertarian when you were younger.
Even when I was a libertarian, I was a pro-life libertarian. It seemed to me that the purpose of the government was to protect individual rights, and the right not to be deliberately killed is first and foremost among those. So there have been a lot of pro-life libertarians over the years. In fact, most of the libertarian presidential candidates during my lifetime, or at least my adulthood, have themselves been pro-life.
Yeah, so
Ron Paul being one example of that.
Yeah, and so I mean, this is based on so I guess since I've read conservative thinkers, libertarian thinkers, I know the general idea, but like I think some of the listeners are going to be confused because they think of being pro-life as something to do with Christianity, to do with religion, which you've spoken extensively how it there's no necessary even though there's a correlation. Can you talk about maybe the non-aggression principle and just the secular pro-life argument?
Oh, sure. I mean, the secular pro-life argument actually overlaps a lot with the Catholic pro-life argument. I'm a convert to Catholic Christianity, in that we start with facts of biology that don't require any religious revelation to grasp. That the unborn child, as we would call it, or let's say the human embryo, the human fetus, is a living organism of the human species. And there are certain philosophical arguments that we can then add to that basic fact, about treating like things like, about following the golden rule and so forth. And we go from there to this idea that it is gravely unjust to take that life deliberately, to take an action that is designed to bring about the end of that life, and that does bring about the end of that life, unless we have some kind of justification that is like a traditional justification for the taking of a human life, right? Like self-defense, for example, which can come into play in those rare cases when a pregnancy threatens a mother's life, for example. What I think Christianity adds to that is this injunction that you are morally obliged to do justice, that God is calling on you to pursue justice. And so I would never say, sometimes my fellow Christian pro-lifers will say something, it's irrelevant to my religion. It's not a religious thing at all. It is a religious thing in that sense, in that it helps supply the motivation for doing something about it. It's not just an abstract truth. But of course, you can be a non-Christian. In fact, you can be a non-believer in any religion and still hold the basic philosophical case that I believe. So, for example, the great civil libertarian Nat Hentoff, who wrote for the Village Voice for many years, was a professed atheist, but also a pro-lifer.
Yeah, I was that was immediately what came to mind. I actually don't know the history of how these, because obviously abortion became a live issue in the 60s and 70s. How did the coalitions kind of coalesce before? Like, what were their deep history? Like, I know there's arguments about Margaret Sanger, and then Susan B. Anthony. All these early, and it gets really confusing for me when I try to do the historical archaeology there. Obviously, the Catholic Church has its position, but I mean, was its position the same in the 19th century? Because I've heard people say, oh, well, they've actually changed their position based on the science. Like, what is the history? Because in the present, everything is really stark. But obviously, it wasn't always like that, right?
Right. Well, yeah, the history is tangled, and it depends, I guess, where we want to start it. The Catholic Church certainly believed that human life should be protected from the moment it could be discerned, but they awaited scientific discoveries, just like everybody else, to inform them of when that was. So before really, the 1820s, I think you'd say, you had the legal standard of quickening, which the idea that we didn't really know what was in the womb until that point. But as our understanding grew, so people understood that the application of the moral principle had to tighten. And we saw not just the Catholic Church change its doctrine, but also American law, starting around that time, started tightening as well. And that really didn't much reflect the influence of the Catholic Church, which wasn't really setting the policy agenda in the United States at that time.
Well, so speaking of the churches and Christianity, it's famously actually, I have two questions. So Reagan, apparently, Ronald Reagan signed a decriminalization law in the late 1960s, and he said that was a mistake. I haven't investigated in detail. Did he know what he was doing at the time? And second, what's happened with evangelical Protestantism? Because I've read that they were not focused on this until relatively recently. So can you just tell me the historical intellectual journey?
So, well, first of all, one of the interesting things about this is that the Republican Party historically had more of a pro-choice lineage than the Democratic Party did, right? So the Democratic Party is the party, let's say in the mid-1960s, it's the party of Catholics. And the Republican Party has a lot of historical ties to Planned Parenthood. Prescott Bush was a supporter of Planned Parenthood, for example. Reagan, as governor in 1967, he's a new governor. He signs a bill liberalizing abortion. He knows enough about what he's doing to agonize about it, to wonder whether he's doing the right thing. And it was not a Roe v. Wade kind of bill. It was a health exception kind of bill, but including mental health. And he said, at least afterwards, that he did not foresee the extent to which the medical need for an abortion would just become a pro forma thing, and you would have abortion on demand. So his biographer, Lou Cannon, says that as early as the early 70s, he is regretting that decision. And he certainly, by the time he's running for president in 1980, he's a committed pro-lifer. Your point about evangelical Protestants is right as well. A lot of evangelical Protestants sort of thought of this as some sort of weird Catholic cause at the beginning. And it took people like Francis Schaeffer and others to argue that this was a grave moral evil that evangelicals had to make common cause with Catholics on. And really, that took a lot of work. I mean, it wasn't really until the mid 1990s that alliance was as strong as it is now.
Well, so, this is interesting sociology. So, we know about the evangelicals, but I get a sense generally like American Jews tend to be extremely pro-choice, extremely supportive of abortion rights, right? But what is it like within, say, the Orthodox community? I'm just kind of curious about, there's an evolution in a lot of groups and like how they're evolving on this topic over the last couple of generations.
Yeah. There is a division among American Jews with, as you say, most of them falling on the pro-choice side of that argument quite strongly. But especially again among Orthodox Jews, there's a lot of opposition as well. And of course, there are the kinds of debates that one might expect among co-religionists or sort of near co-religionists about who is being truer to the faith in taking that position. I think that the way this issue has worked, and if you don't mind my taking the risk of rambling a little bit on it,
that's what we're here for.
So I think that so abortion, I think, is this tectonic plate issue in American politics. In most elections, it's a decided minority of voters who treats it as their top issue, and yet I think it really does. It has changed both parties' coalitions more than any other issue. And part of the way I think this works is, let's say you are, let's say you're an agnostic person or an atheist, and you're a person who has qualms about abortion. You think maybe it should be restricted after the first trimester, that it should be prohibited after the first trimester, but you're not comfortable with pro-lifers. You're not comfortable with the pro-life party because that smacks of a lot of other things: attitudes towards women, attitudes towards religion, just people you don't like, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily, you're arguably you're pro-life, but you're not voting that way. And in a way, that issue has helped make you politically the way you are. And I'd say the same thing on the other side. Let's say you're a Southern Baptist and you're somebody who has real doubts about the pro-life position. You think, well, what about coat hangers? Or, sometimes women are in really, really terrible situations and this is the least bad option and so forth. But everybody in your community is a Republican, and as a pro-life Republican at that. And so you have that view still, but you just don't think of yourself as somebody who would vote for the Democratic Party. So I think that kind of affinity is the way this issue has done so much to change the party's complexions.
It sounds like it's almost like a flag, like it's a symbolic like representation of a lot of things, and it's hard to go against that particular issue, no matter what your like what you would fill out on a survey. So one of the questions that I have sometimes is like, okay, what do people mean when they ascribe to themselves this term? Because I know people who are very uncomfortable. Like if they, sometimes the people who are opposed to the death penalty will say like, well, people should be comfortable watching someone get killed if they support this. But when you apply the same logic to abortion, people freak out. And it's because they're obviously quite ambivalent about the topic, no matter like if they say they're pro-choice, right? And so it's like I think these terms are flattening kind of like a spectrum of views, right? And like there are people who could be like on like opposite sides of the issue officially, but then when you look at what they actually believe, they're much closer. I mean, do you think that's correct assessment?
I think public opinion on abortion is extremely complex, sometimes self-contradictory, and you have to be careful about that, right? I mean, you don't want to just say, well, people who don't have the same view as me, who have a position in the middle, they're not coherent. But I think really, if you look at the polling, people will say things like, you can easily get a majority in polls that will say things like abortion should be illegal except for cases of rape, incest, and the mother's life. And at the same time, get a majority yes to abortion decision that should be between a woman and her doctor. Now, these are not fundamentally logically compatible positions, right? I mean, so that's more than ambivalence for some people, for that overlap group that's in both majorities. And I think the thing that came to me after studying the public opinion on this for quite a while was that partly this reflects the discomfort that people have with abortion. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to hear about it. It is a deeply unpleasant topic for most people. And I think that, that aversion makes a certain amount of sense.
Yeah. Well, so, we're talking about abortion and, I think your position is pretty clear, but I think when we have the whole trimester division and, do you, as a pro-life person, as a political person, what do you think about tactically going after, say, the third trimester or the second trimester, as opposed to the bigger issue? Where's the Republican Party going? Where's the pro-life movement going? Where are social conservatives going? Because, it's like there are some battles here that just seem so easy to win, and then others, frankly, are going to be really difficult.
Well, of course, there are all kinds of tactical debates among pro-lifers on that question. And there are pro-lifers who are against taking that tack of saying, let's start with the third trimester and try to build a consensus that way. And I understand why they want to do that. We've got a moral principle that says, the human embryo 1 week after conception is a living organism of the human species that should not be deliberately killed, just like the 8-month-old fetus. But I myself side with those who would say what we should say to people is, look, I believe that unborn children should be protected and long welcomed in life. I understand that you don't agree with me or you don't fully agree with me. Can we at least agree on the third trimester? And let's start there, and let's start today. And then we can continue to argue about the second trimester, and we can continue to argue about the first trimester. And of course, people who are sort of hardcore on the other side understand perfectly that a lot of us who want to prohibit third trimester abortions want to create a slippery slope, right? And so they'll fight us tooth and nail even there.
Okay. So practicality, I have a question. We're both people of a certain age, and we've experienced decline in crime over the last generation, but also the decline in the abortion rate. Like, can you talk about like where that's coming from? Is it just an artifact of demographics? Is it a cultural shift?
So I think it's a lot of things at once. I think that the rising acceptability of single motherhood is part of that story. The diffusion of ultrasound, better and better ultrasound technology is part of that story as well. In the early days of the abortion debate, it was very common for people to refer to the unborn child as like a blob of protoplasm, a mass of cells, collection of tissues, and the gross inadequacy of those sorts of descriptions became clearer and clearer to people in a way that has basically changed that debate and exiled that kind of phraseology pretty much entirely from it. I do think that increased contraception, increased consistency of contraception, has played a role there as well. And you just have a change in sexual behavior in general, right? I mean, if you look at sort of the statistics on things like teenage sexual activity currently compared to, say, the mid 1980s, it's a much more, there's much more, at least caution, let's say, than there used to be. And so I think all of those things are part of the story.
Well, I mean, do you get a sense at all that it's making the pro-life movement less urgent, or is that still the same, like irregardless of the number of abortions?
Well, I'd say the numbers are still horrifying. They're upwards of 900,000 a year, and the state of the law itself, which says, right? I mean, our Supreme Court says that under our Constitution, unborn children are unpersons without a right not to be killed, which, again, quite apart from the numbers, is an injustice from a pro-life point of view.
All right. Actually, I want to get to that, politics, the court, and stuff like that. I want to ask you a couple of random questions because I want to know like how you respond. So I think in 2015, or it's 2016, early 2016, no, 15, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about the gender difference in views on abortion, and it's just like, you've talked about this. There's really no difference. You have to slice and dice the data really intensely to see the difference between men and women, but there's like a talking point. Well, it's because you want to control women's reproductive blah blah blah, all that stuff, reproductive justice, right? Although I think today you can't say women anymore.
People with uteruses, I think, is
okay. Okay, yeah, I don't know
the terminology.
Yes, and the second issue is I've never actually followed up any discussion on this because it seems ridiculous on the face of it, but the idea that the pro-life movement is white supremacist, which, looking at the rates, so I mean, how do you deal with this? Do you ignore it? Do you just, because I've seen you a couple of times try to explain the gender thing, but like how do people who like hold to this talking point, which, like, as I said, it's like just wrong on the face of it, you could, like, how do you respond to that?
Yeah. So let me do the sex thing and then the race thing. I think that it's a good thing that we're taking this head on, since we're two guys talking about abortion policy, abortion.
Oh, you don't know what I identify as, Ramesh.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. I'm making.
I don't have my pronouns.
Right?
Yeah. Presenting, right. Male presenting.
Well, no, I mean, there's like, if we are going to insist that men can get pregnant, I think that the talking point that this is that the pro-life position is hostile to women has to be abandoned. But you're absolutely right that the public opinion surveys find very, very, very small differences between men and women on their views. And what's more, they're not consistently in one direction or the other. So there are some questions where you will see women have a very slightly more pro-life orientation than men do, and some questions where men have a slightly more pro-life orientation than women do. But overall, there are so many other things that make a bigger difference to people's views on this issue, such as whether they're married or single, how often they attend religious services, that kind of thing. And so people want to make this a sort of a war between the sexes in a way that it really isn't. And so the question, I mean, you can make the argument that, well, this majority of American women who would tell pollsters abortion should be banned except in case of rape, incest, and threats to mothers' life, they suffer from false consciousness. They're really part of this oppressive structure that holds themselves down. And at a certain point, we've kind of left the realm of reasonable disagreement, and we have to say that this is just a political cudgel that is being used to delegitimize a position. And sometimes it's because people are in a bubble where they don't realize that American women have the same views as American men on these issues. On the race thing, I really think that is actually much more of a purely politically opportunistic argument that people make. And, I mean, you should look back at the stuff Jesse Jackson Sr. was saying in the late 1970s when he was calling abortion genocide. against Black people. Or look at today's public opinion polls, which continue to find that Black people are more pro-life than white people are. There's just, I think, just not really a shred of truth to it. The argument that I've been seeing make the rounds a little bit more over the last couple of years is that all of these evangelical conservative leaders who had been pro-segregation or anti-desegregation, like Jerry Falwell, they saw that their stance against civil rights was losing, and so they adopted the anti-abortion cause. Now, even if you were to take that the factual premises there as true, what does that tell you? What it tells you is that these political activists and cultural activists found that there was a bigger audience for hostility to abortion than there was for hostility to civil rights. So there were people, a significant enough group of people that it influenced their action, who were fine with civil rights, who were for civil rights, but were also against abortion.
All right. Well, so I have to ask you a question that I've always wondered just about political history. So George H.W. Bush, I believe he was pro-choice until 1980. Al Gore was pro-life. I don't know Biden's stance. I know Jesse Jackson switched. So, you know, the Republicans and Democrats, like many prominent politicians, have had an awakening. I don't really, you know, I've always been skeptical about the sincerity because it seems like it's such a big topic. How could you just change your views in adulthood? Like, have you given thought to that? Like, I mean, how sincere? I mean, you know, I mean, if H.W. Bush, if it wasn't a sincere conversion, then like after he was president, should he just, do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it seems like maybe it was sincere. Like, I don't really know. Like, what do you think about this? Like, does Al Gore, has he been pro-choice so long that it's like he doesn't even remember being pro-life? I mean, does that make sense?
So I think that there are individual stories here, and partly people talk themselves into what they have been saying for a while, even if they started saying it for convenience. Sometimes the position that they dropped was an insincere position, one that they didn't really hold, and so, you know, I mean, I have views on some of these individual cases, but they're not strong views. I would say from sort of 3,000 feet high, when I started writing about national politics in the mid 1990s, my sense of it was that if you were to hold a secret ballot election, secret ballot votes on abortion in the US House, the pro-life side would have done much, much worse. Because there were a lot of Republicans in the House who were pro-life purely as a matter of convenience. That hasn't gone away, but I don't think that it's anywhere close to what it was back then. I think that the pro-life position has become much more normalized in elite strata of our society. And I'll give you another example of that. 1992, I worked for the George H.W. Bush re-election campaign in Washington, D.C., obviously as an extraordinarily junior, you know, as an intern level college, you know, a summer during college kind of thing. And I would say that 3/4 of the people working that campaign were pro-choice. And if you flash forward to what was the race that John Huntsman was in, maybe 2016?
Yeah.
And Huntsman was probably the least conservative person in that race. And I would say probably about 3/4 of his staff was pro-life.
Okay.
Now, not all those people, it's their top issue, but it was, you know, sort of sincerely their issue. It has become this unifying kind of default thing for Republicans in a way that the pro-choice position has become for the Democrats. Just one person I will comment on, Joe Biden. I think Biden, if you look back at his record, he's always been pro-choice, but he's become more pro-choice over time. He was much more willing to say things like, I'm personally opposed to abortion. He voted for a constitutional amendment to allow states to prohibit abortion. But he himself always held the view that it should be legal.
Yeah. It's interesting about Biden because he is our second Catholic president. But I don't really, or he will be our second Catholic. Well, probably be our second Catholic. You'd never. Anyway, He will be a Roman Catholic who is probably president of the United States. I don't really hear any talk of that. That's interesting.
Of his past on the issue. Well, he finished flipping really when he started running for president this time around. He had maintained a career-long, consistent record against taxpayer funding for abortion, and then, in part, because of a revolt on the part of his staff, which is itself kind of telling, he decided he had to flip on that issue and came up with some unconvincing rationales for why I should flip. But now he's for taxpayer funding. I guess one interesting question in my mind is, how committed is he to his new position? And my guess, just total guess, is he'll sign legislation for taxpayer funding if it comes to him, but he's not really going to lift a finger to try to get it to come to him.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Supreme Court, I mean, we talk about this because Coney Barrett is on the court. It's kind of a 6-3 conservative majority. Probably we're just going to see Breyer just retire immediately, but with the 50-50, Roe v. Wade, I don't keep track of this issue closely. Like, it's my whole life. It's been something people talk about, but nothing really changes. Let's be frank, right? Do you think that you, as a person who's been really involved in this, like, there is a possibility that it will be overturned, like, within the next decade?
Absolutely. I think it's a possibility that it will be overturned. Even greater probability, I suppose, mathematically has to be a greater probability that it is either overturned or chipped away at, that it's hollowed out, that states start getting more authority to prohibit abortion late in pregnancy, for example, or to create more regulations on abortion clinics, subject them to the same kinds of to these same kinds of regulations as other kinds of medical procedures and medical practitioners. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we have a majority on the Supreme Court that almost certainly believes that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided as an original matter, that it is not a correct interpretation of the Constitution. And the question is how many of the people who believe that are willing to go that step further and overturn that precedent. And, there aren't any guarantees about this. But I think that we've at least got a majority that is not going to extend Roe's holdings and will try to limit it and may even try to reverse it.
Well, so I haven't looked at the econometric analysis of this. One thing that I always wonder about is, like, let's say Roe v. Wade gets overturned, then it's obviously back to the states. Would there actually be, I mean, there will be some decline in the number of abortions, but it seems like a lot of the states have restricted it and made it so difficult in a way where people have to go to other states. So it's like, New York, California, these states have a lot of abortions. And, obviously there's not many people in North Dakota, but, there are states where there's just not that many because they make it so difficult. And so I wonder if you're going to have a situation where it gets overturned, some of these states ban it immediately, but then it doesn't really have an effect because it's already so constrained. There are no clinics in the state, et cetera.
So, forecasting the results of abortion policy under sort of new rules of the game is very difficult. But it's certainly true that the places with the highest abortion rates are also the places with the most political support for abortion. And so California, for example, is going to continue to have pro-abortion policies and a pretty high rate of abortion. There will be places that, again, assuming this hypothetical in which states have the authority again to legislate in this area, that they will be able to get more restrictions than the Supreme Court is currently allowed. Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, arguably, although Georgia may be changing politically, Alabama, and these places, they already have relatively low abortion rates, but they can drive them lower still. And I think that we have seen that the abortion rate is responsive at some level to abortion policy. And so I guess part of the, there are a lot of different scenarios. Let me sort of the optimistic scenario from a pro-life perspective would be, first of all, Roe v. Wade goes away and the kind of the horror stories that have been told about what happens in the country are shown not to be true at that point. That we are not hurtling toward a Handmaid's Tale at that point. And maybe it becomes a little bit, as it becomes subject to local give and take, maybe there is less insistence that third trimester abortion can't be restricted. And so even some of the bluer areas of the country maybe start doing that, which would also have a very limited effect on the abortion rate, because most abortions take place prior to the third trimester. But I think sort of starts helping to send a signal, sending a message that that this is something that public policy seeks to discourage. It's not a human right. It's, I would say it's the denial of a human right, but at the very least, it's not sort of a core part of American identity, which is the way, which is the way, frankly, the Supreme Court has sometimes articulated it.
Yeah, now that we're talking about this, I want to ask you, we're talking about America. America seems to be a country where the policy has been kind of out of sync with maybe the majority view because of a rule by, let's be frank, lawyers and judges, right? There are other countries where it's not like this. So my impression, as someone who doesn't follow this closely, is that abroad, the pro-life cause is actually suffering a lot of defeats in Ireland, in Argentina, in some of these Catholic countries where it just hasn't been a discussed issue because there's a consensus, and now there's more of an American style debate, but the policy is flipped, where it's like the pro-choice
Right.
people are on the march. Is this correct? What are your thoughts on this change that I'm seeing?
Well, I think this is a fight that is increasingly part of other countries that are historically Christian, where because we were talking earlier about how these things not being sort of tightly logically connected, but certainly where religious belief declines, we tend to see support for the right to life decline as well. And prosperity seems to be entangled in all of these trends at the same time. And in the case of Ireland, the Catholic clergy, the Catholic hierarchy discredited itself in such a spectacular way with the sex abuse scandals, in a way that left them not just without any moral authority to make the traditional case that everybody else on that side was expecting them to take the lead in making, but also not even inclined to make the case themselves. They took the view that, oh, well, we can't get involved because we'd only hurt the cause. And so it was, but that kind of scenario, I think, has played out in other places, and to some extent in the United States even as well. So yeah, I think this is a big fight. I have paid much more attention to, obviously, what's close to home, to the US, to injustice in American law that needs to be extirpated. But there are definitely places that have better policies than the US does. And certainly sort of the policies that are on the books, the US is sort of an outlier in just how extreme pro-abortion it is. And other places, so people are talking about Poland liberalizing the kind of, actually Poland's moved in a slightly more restrictive direction, but even the kinds of liberalization people are asking for there, what's on the table is not anything close to a kind of US style abortion on demand regime. And there have been moves in places like Britain to move the dates so that you have more restrictions on abortion than you've had previously. It's like moving from 28 weeks to 24 weeks, for example. I don't recall where that stands right now.
Prenatal testing. It's very common now, and people don't talk about it too much. Do you think the pro-life movement is going to have to tackle that?
Well, so prenatal testing, I think, is not in itself an evil. So, for example, if you're testing for Down syndrome and it is a way of preparing for what's coming, or for what may be coming, given the probability that the test reveals, that's one thing. The problem is when it is allied to, when it's against the backdrop of a regime and a culture of abortion on demand.
Mhm.
And in that case, the prenatal testing becomes a tool for the culling of the population, for the discriminatory killing of a select class of unborn children. And then I think it's extremely problematic. And the way it is practiced in the US is problematic. I have known many pregnant women, including my wife, who've had their doctors just assume A, that they're going to be tested for all of these things, and B, that if the test comes back showing high risk, that you need an abortion referral, and that's what's going to happen next. And if not, then maybe you're some religious weirdo, or at least that's the sense that people get. And people who have children with Down syndrome, who carried those babies to term, sometimes report that they feel judged for having had those children, or at least not given any sympathy on the ground that, well, you chose to have that baby and you had options. And it's a deeply dehumanizing way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking, ways of thinking help determine our ways of feeling as well. And so one of the reasons, it's part of this larger culture of abortion that pro-lifers have to work to change. And hopefully part of that is by showing people who aren't totally with us what's ugly about that culture.
And so you think it's totally separable, though? It's a separable issue, and you guys can just separate it.
Well, it's not a separable issue in the sense that the evil of it flows from the abortion policies that we have.
Okay.
So, for example, but there are prudential questions about how you tackle this evil. I would not say that it makes any sense to try to restrict prenatal testing. I do think that it makes sense to say people should not be allowed to abort their children on the basis of sex. Now, when you actually think about how you'd enforce that policy, you're not going to be able to enforce it a whole lot, but at least you put down in the law the idea that this is an unjust act. This is an immoral act. This is not something that we should do.
Right. So I guess like a last question I want to ask, actually, we've been talking about religion and its relationship to abortion. So if you are opposed to gay marriage and say you are a CEO of a company, that's going to be a problem for your Twitter feed. In terms of like, it's going to be a PR problem, right? It's like taboo now. You could be work for National Review and you're like a professional conservative, but for a normal person, it's just not, it doesn't seem like it's a tenable thing for a public person, but abortion is different. Like you could still be pro-life.
Right.
I'm kind of curious. I know Ross Douthat and others have had some hypotheses for why the gay issue, which was much more marginal in the 90s, gay marriage was a much more marginal position, a more taboo position. Obama opposed gay marriage officially in 2008, so that showed you where the culture was. Like, can you talk a little bit as we close out, like why abortion in particular? And I think some people can anticipate, but why it's so different than these other social issues, which seem to just change in a protean fashion.
Right. So we've kind of come full circle to the first thing we were discussing here. And I think part of it is that the case against abortion lends itself to the language of rights in a way that the case against same-sex marriage did not. In fact, the rights arguments cut the other way. And in the case of, for the same reason that you can be a libertarian and be for the right to life. It's a funny thing about libertarianism in the US, right? Because so few Americans as a percentage are libertarians or even are familiar with the term. And yet both of our non-libertarian political coalitions regularly default to the language of libertarianism when they want to attack the other side. There's just a deep strain of it in our culture. And it is not a strain in our culture that settles the abortion issue. And it gives both sides kind of purchase, gives us both traction in a way that's not the case on same-sex marriage. Just think about the fundamental slogan that everybody uses without thinking for tolerance: live and let live. right? I mean, it's a pro-life slogan, right? If you think about it in those terms. And I think that the sort of gets at the sort of the fundamental way abortion, opposition to abortion just isn't like the other socially conservative issues.
I see. All right. Well, it's been great talking to you. This is I don't know. I think we're going to be talking about this particular issue actually more in the 2020s, just because of the way the courts are arranged and our culture and stuff like that. So I feel like we kind of took a break in the 2010s as other cultural issues came to the fore, and so I think I think it's going to be more relevant. So it's been great talking to you, Ramesh.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed the conversation.
This podcast for kids